Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak in London again. The last time I was here was about 6 years ago at the London Forum, actually. But Jez was here, and it's a pity he's not today. But I'm glad of the opportunity, and this time I shall speak to you not of Richard Wagner, but of the history of conservative political philosophy. I actually read a book called Nobilitas in 2001 or something, recounting the history of aristocratic political philosophy in the West. And this is based largely on it, though it has some additions also. So I shall begin with Francis Fukuyama, the Japanese-American intellectual spokesman for the Jewish-American neoconservative movement, who proclaimed in his book, The End of History and the Last Man, that liberal democracy was the final socio-political form, since early alternatives such as fascism and communism had proven to be ideological failures, and liberty and equality had now been established as universal norms. Fukuyama's view of history moving in progressive political phases was of course first popularized in the 19th century by German thinkers like Hegel, Marx and their followers, who sought to discern historiographical patterns in the vagaries of military and economic fortune, and to either celebrate or revolt against the current political status of their own nation, in their case, Germany. To be sure, Hegel was somewhat more elevated than Marx in supposing the course of history to be the varying manifestations of a developing Weltgeist, or world spirit, whereas Marx's materialist historiography was ruled by mere economic alterations. Nevertheless, the falsehood of even Hegel's philosophy of history is made clear to anyone who considers the history of a country which is actually promoting liberal democracy now as a universal norm, and that is America. In America, there has been, from its inception as an independent nation, hardly any deviation from liberal democratic goals, and communism and fascism have not only been absent there in their European forms, but are, if they ever emerge, quickly absorbed into the unchanging liberal democratic framework of the nation. Actually, what American society represents is a sort of ahistoric, quasi-communist utopia, where private individuals strive ever most strenuously to possess the means of production and to resist the interference of the state in public affairs. There is little also to distinguish the communist ideal of equality from the liberal. When Fukuyama suggests that we have come to the end of history, therefore, what he means is that the world that has actually undergone genuine historical changes has now been conquered by a country that began and continues as a utopia that is as little capable of historical change as of real progress. That is progress understood not in the technological, but in the traditional sense of the development of the spiritual, intellectual, and social attitudes of a people. The end of history is indeed a phenomenon that is peculiar to America as a British colony, that has had tenuous connections with the naturally developing history of the old world. While most countries founded by colonial settlement managed to maintain and develop the culture of their mother nation to a certain extent, as Australia, for example, has done, America began and developed at a time of Protestant and Puritan revolt against the ancient Catholic monarchical traditions of Britain. It is important, therefore, to consider the phenomenon of Puritanism, which provoked the English Civil War, during which America was settled, and to notice the close connection also between Christian Puritanism and Judaism. We may recall in this context that the Jews who had been officially expelled from England in 1290 by Edward I, were allowed by the Puritan dictator Cromwell in the 1650s to return from Holland, where they had been conducting a flourishing financial business. And throughout the Commonwealth, the Jews were held in high esteem by the Puritans. The similarity of the capitalist ethics developed by the Puritans and that of the Jews was noted also in 1911 by the German sociologist Werner Sombart in his book The Jews and the Economy. Sombart maintained that the Protestant ethic that Max Weber, another German sociologist, had focused on in his 1905 work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, was indeed to be identified specifically as a Puritan one that should be equated to Judaism. For, as Sombart explained, and I quote, "In both will be found the close relationship between religion and business, the arithmetical conception of sin, and above all, the rationalization of life." With the American Civil War of 1861-65, the last links with monarchical England that had persisted in the pro-English Confederate South were cut by the victory of the Federalist North. Then, in the aftermath of the Civil War, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the Christian religious aspect of the original Puritan work ethic of the Americans was seriously impaired by the large-scale influx of Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, who succeeded in modulating the philo-Semitic Puritan character of American capitalism into a fully Jewish one. As Sombart pointed out, the Jews had indeed been active in American economic life already from the 17th century and had gradually come to monopolize many branches of American commerce, such as the wheat, tobacco, and cotton trade. But we must note that the increased immigration of Eastern Jews at the end of the 19th century and the promotion of Jewish finance capitalism, what remained of the original Puritan work ethic and concomitant frugality in the American economy was soon dissipated, while the only vestige of the dissident puritanical religiosity that survived was its stubborn anti-clericalism. With the replacement of the Puritan veneration of industry by the parasitical reign of finance, the Jewish tendency to economic utopianism, which manifested itself in the 20th century as totalitarian communism in Russia and Eastern Europe, was transformed in the new promised land of the Jews into the totalitarian liberalism of the American dream. As Sombart put it, what we call Americanism is nothing else, if we may say so, than the Jewish spirit distilled. The capitalism promoted by the Jews steadily strengthened the nation's commitment to individualistic freedom and material aggrandizement rather than to the civilizational aims of the old monarchies and empires. Such a nation could naturally not evolve or acquire a human history. Instead of producing examples of human greatness, it could only boast of a bourgeoisie that aspired to millionaire status, and instead of historical development, it could only experience periodic economic booms and recessions. Fukuyama himself attempts in his book to introduce a Nietzschean question into the glorification of liberal democracy by raising the spectre of the last man, or the average American-like man, whose life is materially sated and spiritually meaningless. But with naive optimism, Fukuyama maintains that such an intolerably vacuous life will certainly be conquered in a liberal democracy by man's spiritedness, a human characteristic that will inevitably rebel against such a monotonous existence. This spiritedness is the same as what Plato called the middle part of the tripartite soul, between the rational and the animal parts of it. In Fukuyama's view, in the liberal democratic system, instead of its reappearance in violent strife, as in the case of nationalist or imperialistic states, there will be an absorption of this passionate energy into sports, business, and political shows like election campaigns. Fukuyama's belief in such social engineering as liberal democracy universally aims at ignores the vast difference between the states of the old world and the American. Indeed, the neoconservative enterprise propagated by Fukuyama serves as a reminder of the incompatibility of American with genuinely European systems of political thought. The American social values that are being imposed in Europe and the rest of the world through economic and military means are essentially alien ones and are neither likely to take root easily nor endure. For like the American nation, European and older nations have a historical vitality that cannot be suffocated by American avarice. In order to illustrate this fact, I shall survey here the characteristic political traditions of the Indo-Europeans and the contradictory intellectual movements that have distorted these traditions in the course of modern history. To understand the traditional Indo-European social ethos, I may begin with paradigmatic Aryan conceptions of society discernible in ancient India. The famous caste system of the Indians is, unlike the modern Western class system, an entirely spiritual one, and men are recognized not by their economic status, but by their hereditary spiritual capacity. The four Indian social orders are represented symbolically as the head, arms, thighs, and feet of the primordial cosmic form of the divine soul called Purusha, or man, Adam in the Middle East. The manifestation of the soul itself is understood to be due to its three inherent forms of energy, and they're called Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. The first representing perfect existence, the second motion, and the third inertia. Since there is an intimate and unavoidable correspondence between the macrocosm and the human microcosm, these three energies appear embodied in differing degrees among humans too. The sattvic, highest element, most fully in the Brahmins, the rajasic in the warriors, and the tamasic in the Vaisyas and the Shudras. This is the original spiritual and psychological basis of all hierarchy. The Brahmin owes his preeminent position in society to his superhuman spiritual power. The name Brahman of the deity, who represents the intellectual light and consciousness of the cosmos, itself derives from a word denoting creative power, and it is the privilege and duty of the Brahman to represent this creative power, while the Kshatriya, or the political rulers and warriors, only serve to maintain this creative power, both within the land and also in the universe. The Brahman and Kshatriya thus constitute the paradigmatic Indo-European polity, centered on the dual organs of what in European politics are called church and state. The people, as such, do not have any major political role, either as a bourgeoisie or as a proletariat. If we turn to the Greek philosophers, we find that in Plato and Aristotle, the state is again constantly conceived of in terms of the constitution of the universal and individual soul. Just as in ancient India, the soul, or psyche, in Plato's Republic is divided into three parts: a higher rational or spiritual part, a middle passionate one, and a lower sensual. Since society is as organic a phenomenon as the individuals of which it is composed, in a state too, the more the rational aspect predominates over the passionate, the closer it approximates to the ideal political form. But the disciplines of the lower desires by the dictates of reason is to be found only in a few, and these are the best born and the best educated men, as he says in Republic. Whereas the untrained and untamed passions are to be found in abundance among children, women, and the lower classes, which form the most numerous section of society. The aristocratic guardians of Plato's ideal republic are therefore required to be true philosophers and will not be drawn from the inferior classes. Aristotle continues Plato's spiritually oriented political theory in his Nicomachean Ethics, where he declares that the main aim of politics is the attainment of the good of the nation. The higher classes of a nation will comprise the full citizens who will assume the military and administrative, including priestly, offices of the land. The legislators must govern with a clear knowledge of the spiritual constitution of man, that is, the rational and the other elements that Plato had discerned in the individual soul. And it is the duty of the legislators to ensure the predominance of the higher aspect of the soul over the lower. Platonic principles reappear in the European Renaissance in the writings of aristocratic thinkers like Francesco Guicciardini and Jean Bodin. According to Guicciardini, who offered a critique of Machiavelli in one of his works, the chief reason of the superiority of the prince and an aristocracy to the people is that they are not subject to pernicious passions, such as notably envy. The French Renaissance philosopher Jean Baudin, who is notable for his championing of monarchical absolutism, also based his defense of the latter on a similar Platonic basis. For genuine monarchy is, according to him, derived from the divine law, and the monarch is the earthly image of God. Care should be taken that the religious foundations of the state are never brought into doubt, and religious leaders must act as censors of the state in order to maintain moral discipline in it. It is at this juncture in the history of the world that the revolutionary anti-monarchical ideas of the English Civil War, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution appear. If we study the American Bill of Rights of 1789, we realize that it was based largely on the English Bill of Rights of 1689, promulgated by the Puritan English Parliament after the glorious Protestant Revolution of 1688, in order to curb the powers traditionally invested in the formerly Catholic monarchs of England. One of the most influential English thinkers of the 17th century, and one generally considered to be the father of liberal democracy, John Locke, was also a Puritan. Locke was a champion of the separation of the church and state and had a profound influence on the American founding fathers, such as Thomas Jefferson. The American Bill of Rights, based on the British parliamentarian one, is especially notable for its dissociation of the American state from any official religion. So what had begun in England as a rejection of Catholicism was thus turned in America into a rejection of all official religion. Combined with this fear of theocracy was the puritanical devotion to individual freedom and industry, which caused the Americans to view citizenship as a status defined primarily by liberty, and citizens as economic units of production, not unlike those of the later communist utopia of Marx. A little later, in the middle of the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau propagated in France the Lockean conception of government as a social contract directed by the volonté générale, general will of the people, which would reduce the inequalities springing from subservience to the state. However, a robust answer to Rousseau's doctrine of the social contract was offered immediately after the fateful French Revolution by Edmund Burke in his Reflections, where he pointed out, and I quote, that the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, calico or tobacco, or some such low concern. And since the people cannot be relied upon to follow any general will towards the attainment of the good of the nation, Burke proposed a natural aristocracy as the only viable government of a nation. A strong nation is also necessarily a religious one, for as Burke said, all politicians act on behalf of what he calls the one great master, author, and founder of society, namely God. This vital role of religion in the conduct of states was reiterated in post-revolutionary France by the French monarchist Count Joseph de Maistre, who noted in his essay that the duration of empires has always been proportionate to the degree of influence the religious element gained in the political constitution. Indeed, truly political laws of a land are synonymous with the religious feelings of the people. And the instant man separates himself from God to act alone, he does not lose power, but his activity is negative and leads only to destruction. To follow the doctrines of Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau and Voltaire would thus result in a return to a state of anarchy and degeneracy. In Germany, around the same time, philosophers like Kant and Fichte were beginning to point to the crucial significance of the state as the means of enforcing an enlightened government. Kant took as his point of departure the excellence of divine law in relation to natural law, so that reason, or the moral law, was elevated far above the mindless workings of nature. To establish this rule of the moral law on earth, Kant proposed a supremely powerful state that would control all religious and commercial offices in the land. The leader of the state can never be a democratic representative of the people, since democracy inevitably results in despotism. While Kant favored a monarchical republic, Johann Fichte advocated a Platonic philosopher-statesman who is at once a political and religious leader of his nation. Like a Platonic guardian, such a statesman would, and I quote, in his estimate of mankind, look beyond that which they are in the actual world to that which they are in the divine idea. The monarch will bear the responsibility of the realization of the inner freedom of the individuals within his nation. It's important to note in this context Fichte's emphasis that the aim of all society is ever increasing ennoblement of the human race, that is, to set it more and more at liberty from the bondage of nature, just as the aim of all culture is to subject nature to reason. In order to counteract the spurious freedom that especially the young hanker after, Fichte insists that a new system of education must be developed, which, and I quote, essentially destroys the freedom of will and produces, on the contrary, strict necessity in the decisions of the will. The state continues to be glorified in the idealistic philosophy of Hegel, for whom the state, and especially the Prussian state, is the embodiment of rational freedom, realizing and recognizing itself in an objective form. And in the Prussian nationalism of Heinrich von Treitschke, the state is glorified to an extent that it becomes a sort of substitute for God. Treitschke takes care to stress that, and I quote, the consciousness of national unity is dependent on a common bond of religion, for religious sentiment is one of the fundamental forces of the human character. Unfortunately, the interference of Jewish elements in German politics, he pointed out, had disturbed the traditional spiritual ordering of society by encouraging what he says is the coexistence of several religions within one nationality, involving an irreconcilable and ultimately intolerable difference of outlook upon life. Directly opposed to these several statist doctrines of the German idealists and rationalists is the doctrine of communism, which was propounded in the middle of the 19th century by the Jewish political economist Karl Marx. The radical difference between the Marxist view of the world and the European is already evident in the fact that Marx's system was based on a materialism that totally denied the existence of any spiritual reality whatsoever, and of all metaphysics in general, in favor of a dialectical socioeconomics that attempted to understand the transformations of society according to its changing modes of production. Unlike Hegel, who had justified history as the changing manifestations of a quasi-divine world spirit, Marx wished to create history by focusing on what he considered its essential economic activities. As he put it in the German ideology, morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness have no history, no development, but men developing their material production and their material intercourse alter, along with their real existence, their thinking and the products of their thinking. However, the communist system, for all its apparent evolutionary aspirations, is an anti-scientific utopian construct aiming at an anti-human, classless and stateless society based on the common ownership of the means of production. In this delusional sociological experiment, Marx focused especially on class struggle, on the conflict between capital and labour as a primary instrument of historical change. By granting economic, social and political equality to all citizens, Marx believed that the social awareness and discipline of every individual would naturally be increased. And while he tolerated a representative parliamentary political system as a transitional stage, his communist utopia aimed at a final dissolution of the state apparatus, which is what induces hierarchy and inequality, at the most advanced state of communism, when the people would become fully self-governing. Marxism is thus the fullest expression of a liberal worldview that is diametrically opposed to the traditional, conservative Indo-European ordering of society according to spiritual character, which we have observed in ancient India, Greece, and the rest of Europe until the advent of Puritanism in the middle of the 17th century. Marxism is naturally also opposed to the state structure that supports the religious and warrior aristocracy that founded, constitute, and preserve the nation. It may be noted here that although modern liberal democracies pretend to abhor the communist ideology, the arrogation of political powers in the West by the commercial middle class represents a major step towards the same dissolution of the concepts of national authority and sovereignty that communism too strives for. Marxist political economic theory was strongly criticized at the turn of the century by many notable German thinkers like Eugen Dühring and Oswald Spengler. But I should like to highlight here two of the most metaphysically structured political philosophical responses to Marxism, and these are the theories of the Italian fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentile and the pro-fascist thinker Julius Evola. According to Gentile, the basis of evil, exactly as in Plato and Plotinus, is matter, or nature, which is opposed to spirit and represents, as it were, and I quote him, not merely moral and absolute nullity, but the impenetrable chaos of brute nature, mechanism, spiritual darkness, falsehood, and evil, all the things that man is forever fighting against. Gentile points out that the economic life focused on by Marx is marked by a utilitarianism akin to the instinctual life of animals, and is a life of slavery to matter, whereas politics should be a means to spiritual freedom. Indeed, Marxism aimed at the worst sort of social organization, what he calls the utilitarian, materialistic, and hence egoistic conception of life, understood as a realm of rights to be vindicated, instead of as an arena of duties to be performed by sacrificing oneself to an ideal. On the other hand, the fascist understands life as being serious, austere, religious. All its manifestations are poised in a world sustained by moral forces and subject to spiritual responsibilities. The fascist disdains an easy life. Gentile's understanding of society is based on a Kantian ideal of a transcendent society, which is produced by the interaction of the ego and its pure object, the alter ego. It is this conception of a transcendent society which makes man a political animal, as Aristotle had suggested. The gradual self-realization of an individual necessarily entails the enlightenment of his objective counterparts, the other members of society, so that the nation as a whole begins to approach the ideal transcendent society. For Gentile, as for Fichte, the proper intellectual activity of the enlightened individual is the comprehension of the whole of mankind, or the idea of it. And the state is the objective embodiment of the personality of all the individuals constituting it, or the universal common aspect of their will. As he explained in the prefatory essay, Fundamental Ideas, to Mussolini's Doctrine of Fascism, which was published in 1932, the state stands for the conscience and the universal will of man as a historic entity. True political liberty is therefore possible only when the individuals that constitute the state become free through the realization of the universal aspect of their personality. The state, in its universal aspect, is indeed an image of the divine will, and the laws of the state must ever be in consonance with the divine law. Religion, naturally, is not an external aid to the will of the state, but a constitutive element of it. As he explained in his essay, the fascist conception of life is a religious one in which man is viewed in his immanent relation to a higher law, endowed with an objective will, transcending the individual and raising him to conscious membership of a spiritual society. The prime task of the state is to foster the dual development of individuals and of the society. As he put it, the fascist state sums up all the manifestations of the moral and intellectual life of man. Its functions cannot therefore be limited to those of enforcing order and keeping the peace, as the liberal order had it. It is no mere mechanical device for defending the sphere within which the individual may duly exercise his supposed rights. It stands for a principle which becomes the central motive of man as a member of civilized society. And thus, he continues, many of the practical expressions of fascism, such as party organization, system of education, discipline, can only be understood when considered in relation to his general attitude to life, which is a spiritual attitude. Fascism sees in the world order not only those superficial material aspects in which man appears as an individual standing by himself, self-centered, which instinctively urges him toward a life of selfish monetary pleasure. It sees not only the individual, but the nation and the country, individuals and generations bound together by a moral law, with common traditions and a mission which, suppressing the instinct for life, closes the brief circle of pleasure, builds up a higher life, founded on duty. Further fascist views on the formation of an elite or aristocracy in a modern state, we may rely on the views of the other Italian thinker I mentioned, Julius Evola, whose commentaries on fascist Italy and National Socialist Germany contain invaluable counsels on statecraft. Though Evola criticized Gentile for what he considered to be the moralistic aspect of Gentile's state, both thinkers place an equal emphasis on the transcendental dimension of the state. Evola notes this aspect especially in the fascist conception of the state, rather than in the National Socialist one. And I quote him, "In fascist political doctrine, the state was recognized as possessing preeminence in respect to people and nation. That is the dignity of a single superior power through which the nation acquires a real self-awareness, possesses a form and a will, and participates in a supernatural order." In National Socialist Germany, on the other hand, the racial nation took precedence of the state, which had in fact been represented earlier by the Prussian state of the Hohenzollern. And I quote Evola, "Prussia had been the creation of a dynasty that had the nobility, the army, and the high bureaucracy for its backbone. The primary element was not the nation or the folk, the people, rather the state, more than the land or the ethnos, constituted the real foundation and unifying principle. There was none of that in Hitlerism, at least in the area of general political ideology. The state was conceived as a secondary and instrumental reality, while the primary, formative, moving, and bearing force was supposed to be the folk, the people, with the Führer as its representative and incarnation. A populist state is in fact a counterfeit version of the fascist state, since it is what Evola calls a mass state, characterized by collectivizing and demagogic movements with an excitable and subrational foundation, which can also give to the individual the illusory, momentary sensation of an exalted, intense life, likewise conditioned by sensation, by a regression, and by a reduction of personality and true liberty. Evola aptly cites here the writer Ernst von Salom, the German, in order to show that populist nationalism is incompatible with a conservative political one. And I quote Salom, "There could not be, from the historical point of view, any bridge between the state idea and the populist one of the essence of the nation. This fact, unfortunately, was disguised by the disorienting circumstance that the populist formula used the same vocabulary and boasted of being a renewed conception of the state. Not having a strong notion of the state, the Third Reich was also incapable of establishing a supranational state structure, such as the Habsburg Empire preeminently had done. The National Socialist slogan of Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer, was perhaps adequate for pan-Germanist aims, but not for a pan-European one. This inadequacy was especially compounded by the doctrine of Nordic supremacy that made enemies of fellow European nations, like the Polish most notably, that could have been turned into allies against the communist state instead. So that the state is distinct from the nation and the Gemeinschaft, the community of terrorists, does not mean that it is identical to the Gesellschaft or society either. In fact, Evola clearly identifies the societal forces of liberal political theory as its greatest defect. And I quote Evola, "In reality, there is a fundamental antithesis of doctrine between political systems that focus on the idea of the state and those that focus on the idea of society. The second type of system includes the varieties of theories based upon the concept of natural rights, contract theory, with a utilitarian basis, and democracy, with the related developments that stretch from liberal democracy to the so-called people's democracies of Marxism and communism. A fascist state, on the other hand, is concerned with the transcendence that can be achieved only through heroic or military virtues, such as honor and loyalty, that are not only beyond hedonistic values, but also beyond eudaimonistic. Evola goes on to add, and I quote, "If it is not possible to ask everyone to follow an ascetic or military vision of life, it will be possible to aim at a climate of concentrated intensity of personal life that will encourage people to prefer a greater margin of liberty as opposed to comfort and prosperity." The fascist state, as an organic rather than a mechanical creation, is centralized, but not totalitarian, and allows individual liberty except when it is necessary to rein in a shapeless and atomistic mass of individuals and wills. In a fascist state, which is directed against both capitalism and communism, the center will be constituted of a principle of authority and a transcendent symbol of sovereignty. The most natural incarnation of such a symbol is the monarchy. However, and I quote him again, "Monarchy is not incompatible with a legal dictatorship, more or less as it was in the ancient Roman law. The sovereign can confer exceptional unitary powers on a person of special stature and qualification, still on a legal basis, when there are special situations to overcome or exceptional lacks to confront. Thus, when lacking an effective monarch or rex, a state can substitute a dictator or dux, whoever acts by the legitimate and pre-existing system of order, essentially destined to integrate it in case of necessity, in order to consolidate a particular concentration and activation of existing forces. This leader, too, cannot be a modern man of the people, as in the case of National Socialism or communism, or in the present American presidential system, where, as Evola says, people only put up with a leader who is essentially one of us, who's one of the people, who expresses the will of the people, and who is a good friend. The democratic system of endlessly fluctuating party politics is to be firmly rejected, even though the parliamentary framework may be retained, albeit in a higher aristocratic form. That is, the upper parliamentary house, or the House of Lords, should serve as the essential government of the nation, and be constituted of an elite that corresponds to the ancient Indo-European offices of the priest and the warrior. This elite, as Evola suggests, by inserting itself into the normal and essential hierarchies of the state and eventually controlling it, bears to an eminent degree the idea of the state. In this last case, more than a party, it will approximate to an order. This is the same function that in older times was exercised by the nobility as a political class. Though representing the nobility in the modern world, the elite occupying the upper house of parliament will also act as the guardian of the idea of the state and will prevent the Caesarean isolation of whoever exercises the supreme authority. The lower house of parliament should be constituted not of parties that have gained entrance to the weight of popular votes, but of corporate bodies, including the several economic ones, which are all characterized by their function and dignity. So just as the upper house will serve as an advisory council to the king or president, the lower will work in coordination with the ministers and the prime minister. The task of the upper house is first of all to establish its control over the economic powers of the land that are vested primarily in the middle class. And I quote Evola, "The sphere of politics and power should be, by its very nature and function, free from economic influences by economic groups or special interests. It is appropriate to recall the statement of Sulla, the Roman dictator, who said that his ambition was not to possess gold, but to hold power over those who possess it. This hierarchical constitution of the parliament would preclude the domination of the interests of the lower orders, including the bourgeoisie. As Evola points out, a fascist state should take care, on the one hand, to eliminate the proletarian and Marxist influences on the worker, and on the other, to destroy the purely capitalist mentality of the entrepreneur. In general, what Ebola desires is a total reformation of industrial society in a heroic or military fashion. And I quote again, against the Marxist and materialist mentality, the same type of military attitude in the general sense, of which we have spoken earlier, could be made equally effective on the level of work and production. The urgent task of restoring the primacy of politics over economics can be achieved through strictly controlling the monstrous development of capitalism in the direction of unfettered productivity, so that it is, as he says, limited, with the ultimate end of restoring the economy and everything that is economic to the subordinate position in which it becomes only a means to an end, and a circumscribed dominion within a much vaster hierarchy of values and interests. Industry's craving for unlimited change should be reined in by the state so as to allow progress or movement in a vertical direction for the realization of higher possibilities and the true autonomy of the person. The aim of the fascist state should indeed be the Stoic ideal of autarky, or what he calls an ethics of independence, or the sovereignty of the individual. In order to guard this value, where it is necessary, one has to follow the strict principle of abstine et sustine, abstain and sustain. The national economy should be marked by austerity, in the sense of, and I quote him, if necessary, holding the general standard of living relatively low, adopting what the English call austerity, which even in a different context has had to be practiced here and there by different nations after the Second World War, but assuring ourselves a maximum of independence. Thus, as regards the life of the nation in general, Ebola says, we hold the normal situation to be the complete opposite of everything we are witnessing today. Apparently generalized prosperity and thoughtless living from day to day beyond one's means, along with a frightening state debt balance, leading to extreme economic and social instability, growing inflation, and an invasion of foreign capital which brings with it many important visible and invisible influences. Only a state pitched at the level of spiritual transcendence can foster what he calls the development of personality and true liberty, in the sense of virtus. Virtus is the Latin word for manly virtue, according to the classical understanding. As Ebola explains, in truth, personality and liberty can be conceived only on the basis of the individual freeing himself to a certain degree from the naturalistic, biological, and primitively individualist bonds that characterize the pre-state and pre-political forms in a purely social, utilitarian, and contractual sense. So, in these fascist conceptions of history and of the philosophical significance of the state, we see thus the diametrical opposite of the liberal American way of life. They further provide a powerful corrective to the historiographical errors of Hegelians like Fukuyama, who raised the political status quo to an ideal after superficially surveying the external changes of the state, as also to the errors of the Marxists who conjure up utopias from these same changes. All of these thinkers ignore the transcendent or divine aspect of statecraft, which, as we have observed in our initial survey of ancient Indian and Greek philosophy, also provides the true basis of the necessary hierarchical organization of society. The state should ever bear in mind the constitution of the psyche or soul itself and aim, through a sacred kingship or an enlightened aristocracy, at the psychological improvement of the individuals that comprise the state. Materialistic societies governed by economically oriented political doctrines, whether Puritan or Marxist or capitalist, are incapable of any real historical development, because the spiritual element of man, which alone is capable of movement and development, is not best tended by either the middle or the lower classes, but only by an upper class constituted of what the British aptly call the Lords, spiritual and temporal. Fukuyama's historiographic thesis is thus merely a description of the abortive state of America itself, which has through its history gradually substituted materialistic and economic principles of statecraft for the spiritual ones that originally governed all European monarchies, including the British. in considering this American problem, we cannot afford to ignore the fateful role that the Jewish bourgeoisie have played in the history of the West. For the re-entry of the Jews in England during the Puritan Revolution is linked psychologically to the capitalist career of the new American state, as well as to its inevitable transformation into a bourgeois oligarchy. It is all modern political theories that aim at a diminution or dissolution of the state or of the leading religious institution of the nation, whether these theories are called libertarian or populist or anarchist, may be recognized as derivatives of the defective Jewish economic mentality, which is also responsible for the social degeneration generally associated with modernism. This mentality can and should be fully replaced by genuinely Indo-European political doctrines that are not enunciated by the bourgeoisie in the name of the people, but by the non-mercantile aristocratic section of the population that alone can serve as the leaders of any cultured state. Politically, the alliance of both the state and its leading religious institution, in the case of the West, the Church, must be consolidated and their role strengthened through the upper house of the Parliament. The current parliamentary structure of government should be reorganized so that the economic concerns of the lower house and of the Prime Minister's cabinet are dominated by the more aristocratic ones of an upper house dedicated to the elevation of the idea of the state and of its people. This will naturally mean the exclusion of all anti-statist and bourgeois elements, including the Jewish, from the higher echelons of government and society. The philosophical guidelines for the regeneration of nations are already to be found in the long tradition of European conservative philosophy that I have surveyed, and that come to a sharp focus in the fascist doctrine of Gentile and Evola. Of course, fascism has today become a term that is abhorrent to those who blindly follow Judaized America and its various utopian adventures. But it is well to bear in mind that the price of American utopianism is the end of history.
Well, thanks for that intellectual tour de force, Alexander. Has anybody got any questions?
So, okay, I'll go back to Hegel's premises that it's for the individual to develop thinking, being, spirit as a drive towards enlightenment, and through that the individual solves conflicts, and by reflection all those individuals make society evolve. And of course after that we went through Marx that changed the subject to relations with the material system, and then postmodernism and the kind of liberalism we have today. My question is, it's like a shrinking of the individual's faculties from that higher consciousness, if you like, or spirit, to today. It's about very petty conflict resolutions. I think a lot of the pretext of what you're talking about is how do we get back to that higher state, higher awareness? And my question is, practically, would any of those political systems be able to deliver it? Like communism, the subject, the working is the working man's relation with the material system. That can't deliver it. Fascism it's all about the nation state and kind of militarism. Can that deliver it? I don't know. But probably not in terms of the ideas that Hegel's talking about. Liberal democracy, well, we've seen nobody even believes what they're saying anymore. It's all about very, very petty stuff. I mean, maybe it's not about political systems at all. Maybe it's a transformation of the individual. But I'd just be interested to hear what you say about how we get to that.
No, it's not dependent on the individual. As I started saying, individuals are not of equal spiritual capacity. Some people are capable of higher enlightenment, and others are capable of no enlightenment at all. You can't leave it to them to discover, the ideal political form. It is the duty of the government to base itself on the highest philosophical foundations that it can, because it has, philosophical knowledge, and it must orient the development of society in the direction of those values. In other words, it must force the whole society to develop in this direction. not limited to individuals, because individuals can go to India and they can smoke drugs and experience transcendental meditation, whatever, for 2 minutes. But that is not a solution to the problems of America or Europe. So, for the welfare of the state, it is the duty of the state. And I have indicated that power should slowly move from this lower house to the upper house somehow. You have to elect some leader who knows the difference between these two houses. And it is the function of the upper house to govern, not simply to act as a rubber stamp on what the lower house offers. That is the movement that is required. Individuals now, we have seen what they're capable of, next to nothing. And those people who go to India, can just stay here and follow the rules of the state if you have a well-established state.
Is it your view that the structure of the British state, being a constitutional monarchy with two houses, is a very good place to start, according to the views you've adumbrated, as long as one instilled it with a desire for autarky, that the monarch was also the head priest or head priestess of the national religion, and power was given more to the upper than to the lower house.
Indeed, yes. I think you have the ideal set up because you have one of the oldest monarchical systems in Europe. The problem is the Glorious Revolution and the steady transformations after it, so that the monarchy has become more and more a constitutional symbol with little real power. That has to be changed. You have to elect some party, some leader that knows that it must change. You have all the instruments necessary for a transformation. You just have to make the transformation.
In the godless age, how do we as hierarchical thinkers reconcile an autocratic government with the weakness of man and problems of succession?
It is because of the weakness of man that the state should be established strongly. This is the basis of all statist philosophies, that without a state, man is helpless and left to his individual will, which will not make him self-governing, as Marx promised foolishly, but will make him completely degenerate.
But if you centralise power too much in the hands of one man, he can end the nation by himself. If you look at Commodus or certain other leaders, I mean, how do you guard against that?
That is why you have the nobility of the upper house. They will control the dictator or the king if there's a problem, or the serious problem.
What would you say is the viability of what's happening though? I mean, even Everett in his latest stage, I'm talking about books like Right the Tide, he seems to brought some kind of acceleration to end the Caligula. Well, use this in Indian terms, but would you say that was a viable path?
No, I suppose he became somewhat pessimistic towards the end of his life because after the war it was total destruction and chaos and little sign of progress. But he does give, advice on how to regenerate a state, and I think we should take it. It's not just a matter of riding a tiger. You don't wait for any changes to happen gradually because those changes will never come. It is for the state to change. Revolution or change can only come from the top. It will never come from people walking up and down the street.
Slightly a different kind of question. I wonder whether you'd like to say a few words about the book that we have a few copies of, if anyone would like to buy them.
Stead has luckily got some copies of one of my books. This is a book that follows another on a similar subject. It's called Art, the Reconstruction of the Solar Cosmology of the Indo-Europeans, which I published in 2005. In 2012, I produced the second volume, which focuses on the rituals of the ancient Indo-Europeans. and show how they're all solar in nature, that is based on the worship of the sun and the different powers of it. And so it gives you, an understanding of the cosmology that produced this religion and the rituals related to it. It's quite long, and I think quite interesting also because most people think of Indo-European as Aryan alone. Everyone is interested in the Aryans because of Hitler. But actually the Indo-European family is a widespread one and includes many cultures that you would not think belong to it, because they all have the same religion and the same system of worship and so on. So this is about the solar rituals of both the Japhetic, that is the Aryan peoples, and also the Hamitic, that is Mesopotamian and Egyptian and so on. So the similarities are clear, and they are obviously derived from a common source with the same spiritual interest. So that is this book called Brahman, a study of the solar rituals of the Indo-Europeans. It is, I think, quite expensive, but I'm sure you can get a discount.
I think we'll be selling them very, 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 very cheap for £5.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I just want to ask what is your view of the present state of religion in Europe? Do you think that Christianity, for example, there can be any kind of rectification for it to become
should be revived as a state religion, as in the Vatican,
or even Orthodoxy, or even Protestantism?
Right. I am not in favour of mass Protestantism. You are a Protestant nation in England, and you could retain the religion, but as we have seen, what's happened to Protestantism in America is shameful. What you have is now evangelical Protestantism, which is some kind of voodoo religion related to Christian Zionism or something. I don't know. It's just a horror. So, well, you can retain. You have a high church which could serve as the model and maintain. Yeah, but the church must have an active part through the House of Lords, obviously, in the governance of the nation, in every nation.
Oh, I was just going to add a comment to that. There's also the pagan alternative, and the group that I'm involved in. We say prayers to the monarch more than they do in the national church.
You pray to the monarch?
Yeah, we at all our events we always have a prayer to the monarch, and that is something that doesn't take place in the Church of England church on Sunday morning.
Well, it should, I think, because the Catholic Church certainly has a Lord to the King and so on, or used to have. The Protestant Church may have had such prayers in the past. I don't know. They specifically revived. Paganism, is interesting, but it's not organized, and you will find that it has many similarities with Christianity also, so that you don't need to go back to Scandinavia or something to recover the stones that they worship there or the idols. It's just too difficult, and you don't have a priesthood that is continuous and so on. So it's interesting as an academic exercise. I doubt that it is practically useful. We have, the same gods and so on that the Germans originally had, but we still worship them according to rituals that are appropriate and that have been designed, thousands of years ago. You can sort of imitate those, I suppose. But to understand the significance of every deity, you need to study a lot, and all of that is a kind of academic exercise, it seems to me. When there is a Catholic Church that has a long tradition and is still alive and well, or a Protestant one, why not simply go there?
Just
Why are you also averse to your own religion? Is there something wrong with it?
No, I mean, people in this country do not take their religion
Yeah,
seriously.
that is because the state is not doing anything in that regard, and it must.
As a monotheistic religion, how do you see Christianity fitting into the Indo-European
Tradition.
metaphysical
Oh,
tradition?
Christ actually is the same as Brahman. Originally there is the soul, which is the divine soul, ineffable, and that will be God, I suppose, God the Father or something in the Jewish description. And then God the Son would be the light of the cosmos. Light is not just light, but also perfected consciousness. And that is Brahman, and that is Christ, who is the Word, and the Word became flesh, and so on. So it's related to the ancient Indo-European cosmology and philosophy through Neoplatonism in particular. Because Logos and so on is one of the hypostases of Neoplatonism. The one, then Nous, which is intellect, which corresponds to Logos, which corresponds to the Christ, and then Psyche, which is just a material manifesting force. We call it Maya, which is really just illusion. Power that creates this illusion of the world, manifest world. Yeah.
Do you see any realistic path for an aristocratic class to take back power from the banking power and their various methods of control, like control of the mass media?
Only if you change the system of the state itself, and everything that the Prime Minister or his cabinet offers is not readily accepted by the Senate or the House of Lords. In other words, the House of Lords and the Senate will initiate their own laws. They are not just an approving body. They must be the governing body. This is a lower house just to represent the economic bodies and various other bodies, cultural and so on, of the state. They are of lesser significance.
I mean, it's quite interesting in this country now. We've got working class northern men supporting virulently Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is probably the most aristocratic person in the public eye at the moment. But he himself is in favour of replacing the native British with unlimited amounts of migrants because he is part of that banking class.
Right.
And so many of them tend to be.
I don't know about Rees-Mogg. I don't like him very much. But yeah, anyone who is capitalist, whether it's Donald Trump or Jacob Rees-Mogg, it is not reliable because their interests are commercial. That's not aristocratic at all.
We're back to it's a crisis of consciousness. If you're just capitalistic, you're on that level. You're not up here.
Yeah.
But how it's a chicken and egg situation. Crisis of consciousness. It's in the people, the leaders, the upper house, lower house, the aristocracy, everyone.
Well, you have many crises, but somebody must set the crisis right, and only the people at the top can do that if they have the will to do it.
Yeah, I fail to see how we could have the sort of change that we'd like to see, where you said you can't have this sort of change from the populace. It can only come from the top, but we're also saying the top is entirely in control of the people. Yeah, but it is entirely in control of the people who we are opposed to. So where could this change come?
The top is not entirely opposed. In Britain, you have lords who are traditionally appointed. I mean, I don't think you vote for the House of Lords. They are actually appointed.
Yes.
Okay, so they are aristocrats by birth and by right and so on, and they just sit there. So they are not controlled by the people.
Well, they have been the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah,
Since
that's
Blair.
because the House of Lords does not have the power that it must have.
Yeah, and they're also appointed now. They've abolished hereditary peerages.
Yeah.
So the traditional aristocracy no longer occupies position of power, even in the House of Lords,
Yeah.
which has had its teeth pulled a long time ago anyway.
The lords are not appointed by the people, but they are appointed by the parties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or by the Queen, or Could the Queen not appoint her?
No, the government appoints them now. I think they're appointed. They're lifelong peers, and the hereditary peers, which represent the true aristocracy, the bloodlines, the aristocratic bloodlines, I believe are very small minority now within the House of Lords by government dictate.
Yeah, but they should predominate by virtue of their greater, culture or greater right to be seated in the House of Lords. The real Lords, I mean.
Oh, the real Lords, sorry, yes, of course.
But they should do something. I mean, they can't sit there and say, okay, we have no power, we have never had power. Then they never will.
In terms of the power of the Queen herself to appoint lords or to do anything of that regard, to use, I think the monarchy's power in this country is more or less existent in the fact that they're not going to use it.
Right.
So the power that the monarchy has in law, the moment they go to use it, it will be decided that this is an overreach and it will be taken away from them. And as such, it means nothing. It's purely an illusion.
It's topsy-turvy since the Glorious Revolution. This is the problem with your Protestant.
Also with the monarchy itself, if we wanted to have a sort of monarchy in this country, as a lot of people have abandoned their religion or they don't believe in the divine right of kings in terms of the right of the monarchy to rule. And the monarchy is existing purely on momentum, that we've had this monarchy for so long, and the monarchy that we have now is so degenerated in the sense that you see with the marriage to Meghan Markle and things like that.
Right.
So that replacing the monarchy, what would be our criteria for that, or can the current monarchy be fixed? Which I doubt.
Well, it has to. I mean, you are not going to remove the monarchy without a French Revolution. You hardly want that, I think. No, it would have to be one of those lines, either from Germany or Austria or something. And you have an existing monarchy. You can continue with it. But once they're given power, I think they will know how to act. At least they will act a little more than they are at the minute. Now they're doing nothing at all. Yeah.
Based on this discussion, would you think that our best realistic first step would be to reform the House of Lords to its original state?
No. You reduce the powers of the House of Commons. Because that is where the bourgeoisie sit. They are the most powerful and the most scheming of all. They will see to it that the upper house never gets power. And so you have to subdue that element in the House of Commons.
Right.
Easier said than done.
Well, there is one way you can do it, actually. This is a fairly straightforward way. Charles, when he becomes king, is also head of the armed forces, and he simply instructs the government to take all the MPs and to lock them up.
I think this goes back to what I said previously, is regardless of what power the monarchy actually has in law in this country, the moment they go to use it, it will evaporate. Because unless people believe they have the legitimacy to use their powers are essentially worthless.
Well, because you're talking about the power of the people to remove them, or
yes, but any action that the monarchy takes has to be.
It has to have popular support.
Yes.
See, at the moment,
to some degree.
At the moment, all laws go to the upper house for approval, right? If the upper house wanted to assert its authority, it can do it subtly and discreetly by slowly reducing the number of approvals it grants.
But they have done this in the past. I mean, in fact, the progressive degeneration of the House of Lords can be seen in terms of the gradual removal of power. Every time the House of Lords seeks to assert its power, the Commons say, well, we're going to take that power away from you. And they've done this.
It's right, seen as an outrage. If the royalty were to not sign assent on a law, or the House of Lords were not to approve something, it's seen as a moral outrage which needs to be crushed.
No.
But of course,
this is their privilege and this is their duty. So, since they are the higher body and they are the approving body, I don't see how the lower body can complain. The Senate in America is blocking the Democratic Party in the House, right? And that is permitted because Trump is very popular. But he should not be in the Senate in the first place, the Republicans. But anyway, if that can happen and the Senate actually can prevail, it can also be the case in the House of Lords.
Because you're saying you don't understand how that can happen. It can happen because we live under what Nietzsche called the slave morality.
No, never mind Nietzsche.
Yeah.
It's actually what you can do in Parliament and what they must do. And I don't believe the House of Lords is completely impotent. It has powers. It has approval powers which are higher than those passing powers that the lower house has. And it can assert its authority.
It's filled with
Well, no,
so
it can't
pointed
really,
socialists.
Alexander, because every time it tries, every time it does it, its powers are further weakened. This is a progress. This is a repeating scenario.
It's not a weakening of its power, it's a strengthening of it. When it asserts its power individually, independently of the House, then it shows that it's independent.
Well, as an example of the weakening of the powers of the House of Lords is the replacement of the hereditary peers by
it shouldn't have approved that in the first place. I don't know how that came about. And
Tony Blair and the jury
She's a law. She made a law.
and they accepted it for themselves. I don't know. This is absurd. It should not happen. It could be reversed, of course.
No, it certainly shouldn't, but it did.
But it can be reversed. All this can be reversed. But anyway, whoever your next leader is or ruling party, they should know about this possibility of change within the constitutional framework of your country. It doesn't have to be a revolution. It's violent, as the French are trying, and so on.
Basically, the problem from my perspective is we have a two-party system that just won't go away. We've basically got two parties that ultimately are exactly the same, just with a different variation of how they sell themselves. And I've always thought nothing's going to change until people just start voting for a party they like rather than this tactical voting, because everyone's voting Tories because they're afraid Labour get in, and everyone's voting Labour, the others are voting Labour because they're afraid Tories are getting in, and we just get the same bunch all the time. Can you see a solution for that?
Well, as he has proposed, or fascists have proposed, you don't have these parties at all because they're just popular parties. What you need is representatives of the different economic groupings and so on, chosen by those groupings, limited as they are, not by universal suffrage or something, and being represented in the lower house. The lower house only has a very practical function, doing things of land, running highways and public works and that sort of thing. That's all. That is the House of Commons, and the Prime Minister is only their leader. He's not such a great figure, nor she. But the upper house is hereditary, it's traditional, and it is the real law of the land.
Well, I agree with the sentiments, Alexander, but unfortunately, the reality...
Unfortunately, that's because you've had a slow transformation ever since that glorious revolution at the end of the 17th century.
Yeah, that is definitely the turning point.
Yeah. So Protestantism has ruined your nation, essentially. But it's not lost. I mean, you still have all the representatives of the old, monarchy and parliament still here. You can work with them. But they must know what to do.
So would you agree that the regicide of our martyr king was in fact a pivotal incident?
Oh, it's pivotal in the history of the world, actually.
Yes.
It was before the American Revolution.
Yeah.
It was horrible. And it was in England.
And it was a necessary precursor, really, when it comes to it.
Right.
Right, we've only got 10 minutes till we have to vacate the room, so is there anybody who's got a burning question to ask Alexander, because it'll be the last question?
Well, let's see, you have to buy my books.
Right, okay then, well, thanks very much, Dr. Jacob, for entertaining us this afternoon.
Yeah.
Very, very good. So, thank you.